Behind the glittering crowns and luxurious palaces, the hygiene of royal women was far from glamorous. Unimaginable filth, shockingly rare baths, and disturbing beauty routines were part of their daily lives, leaving them smelling worse than you could ever imagine. Join us as we expose the horrifying and downright revolting hygiene practices of these royal figures that history conveniently glosses over. Number 6. Dental hygiene and sugar addiction. When we think of royal women from centuries past, we often imagine opulence and elegance, but few realize the hidden dental horrors that came with their sweet obsessions. Sugar, once an expensive luxury only available to the wealthy, played a significant role in the rise of dental decay among the elite, particularly during the Tudor period. Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most iconic monarchs in history, became a stark example of how a royal sweet tooth could lead to shocking dental consequences. During Elizabeth's reign in the late 16th century, sugar was a prized commodity in England, thanks to the booming colonial trade. The Queen, known for her love of all things sweet, indulged in sugar-laden feasts regularly. Elizabeth's excessive consumption of sugar took a heavy toll on her teeth, and things were repulsive by the time she reached her 60s. Paul Hentzner, a German traveler who visited her court in 1599, described her as having black rotting teeth, a side effect of her lifelong sugar addiction. What's even more astonishing is that the Queen attempted to clean her teeth with a mixture of honey and sugar paste, making the situation far worse. At a time when proper dental tools were scarce, these makeshift solutions only accelerated the decay. But it wasn't just Elizabeth. Across Europe, sugar was seen as a sign of wealth, and it made its way into everything from drinks to delicacies enjoyed at royal banquets. In France, Queen Marie Antoinette also indulged heavily in sweets like chocolate, contributing to her dental problems. Queen Marie Theresa of Spain, wife of Louis XIV, was another example of a royal whose sugar addiction had serious consequences. Known for her love of sugary drinks and desserts, she experienced significant dental decay, which eventually led to her developing a notorious case of bad breath. At court, this issue became well known, and although the Queen attempted to mask the problem with perfumes and herbal rinses, her decaying teeth made close interactions uncomfortable. The irony of it all is that sugar itself was both the source of their grandeur and their dental downfall. The more royal women displayed their riches through sweet treats, the more their teeth suffered. Dental care during this period was almost non-existent. While some royals tried to maintain their teeth, the methods available often did more harm than good. Tooth powders, made of abrasive materials like brick dust, cuttlefish, and even ground shells, were the primary means of cleaning. These powders, while they removed surface grime, also wore away the enamel, making teeth more susceptible to decay. Many upper-class women, particularly in the Regency period, were encouraged to use these tooth powders, but the damage they caused became evident over time. In the absence of proper dental tools, royals would also use toothpicks made of gold or ivory to clean between their teeth after meals. These toothpicks, often seen as luxurious accessories, were sometimes engraved with the owner's initials, becoming as much a status symbol as a practical tool. However, this method of cleaning was far from effective in combating the buildup of plaque caused by the constant sugar intake. Tooth decay and gum disease became rampant among royal families. Despite the widespread issue of dental decay, royals did little to address it. In fact, rather than giving up sugar, they sought ways to conceal the damage. Elizabeth I was said to have used false teeth made of ivory, which were inserted to replace the rotting teeth she had lost. However, these early dentures were far from the ones we know today. They often caused discomfort and were poorly fitted, doing little to restore the Queen's smile to its former glory. By the 18th century, the problem only worsened as sugar consumption increased throughout Europe. It wasn't until the late 19th century, with the advent of modern toothpaste and dental tools, that some improvements were made in combating tooth decay. Fluoride, now a key ingredient in toothpaste, was first introduced in 1955, offering some protection against the damaging effects of sugar. From rotten teeth to even more intimate and painful struggles, the next story reveals the hidden discomforts of royal women's lives. Number 5. Menstrual and pregnancy hygiene. Behind the gilded walls of royal palaces, there were dangers during childbirth that no amount of wealth could protect against, and they weren't caused by the pain of labor alone. Menstrual hygiene and pregnancy care for royal women during the medieval and early modern periods were as problematic as they were for commoners, despite the wealth and opulence surrounding them. The royal court may have glittered with jewels and elaborate gowns, but when it came to the intimate aspects of female health, the reality was stark, uncomfortable, and at times life-threatening. Menstruation was an ongoing challenge for royal women. The sanitary products we rely on today did not exist, so women of all social classes, including queens and princesses, had to make do with basic materials like rags. These rags were often reused, cleaned with rudimentary methods, or in many cases not cleaned properly at all. This reuse of unsanitary materials contributed to a high rate of infections, which were often seen as inevitable consequences of womanhood. Even more shocking were the customs surrounding childbirth. In many European courts, childbirth was a public affair. The practice of public childbirth was especially prevalent in France, where it had been mandated by Louis XIV in the 17th century to ensure the legitimacy of royal heirs. This practice continued under Louis XV and was still in place when Marie Antoinette gave birth to her children. She was subjected to this invasive tradition when her daughter, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, was born in 1778. Royal women were surrounded by spectators during their labors, from noblemen to courtiers, who gathered to witness the birth. The purpose of this practice was to prevent any accusations of foul play, ensuring that the child was indeed the legitimate heir to the throne. However, the overwhelming number of people present created an environment that was far from clean, adding to the risks of childbirth. Childbirth was already fraught with danger, and the lack of proper medical knowledge or hygiene during the period made it even more hazardous. Marie Antoinette famously fainted during the birth of her first child due to the intense crowd and the overwhelming conditions in the room. The Queen's labor was made even more difficult by the lack of attention to hygiene. This was not unique to France. Across Europe, royal women gave birth under similarly unsanitary conditions, which often resulted in infections. Mortality rates for both mothers and infants were alarmingly high. In many cases, 1/3 of royal babies died before their third birthday. This grim statistic stemmed from poor hygiene practices during childbirth, as midwives and doctors lacked an understanding of germ theory and rarely sterilized their instruments. Infections like childbed fever were rampant, claiming the lives of many royal women and newborns. For instance, Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, and Charlotte of Wales both died from complications shortly after childbirth, illustrating how dangerous these practices were. Despite the vital role of producing heirs, the health of royal women was often neglected in favor of ensuring a male successor to continue the family line. Pregnancy for royal women was not only a personal burden, but a political necessity. Their primary duty was to bear sons, and failure to do so carried significant consequences, both personally and politically. When pregnancies did occur, the focus was on monitoring the fetus to ensure the child's survival rather than safeguarding the mother's well-being. And if the struggles of menstruation and childbirth weren't horrifying enough, the very palaces they lived in were filled with a different kind of filth, one that will make your stomach turn. Number 4. Toilet practices and waste management. In the grand halls of Versailles, what lay hidden beneath the glittering chandeliers and silk gowns wasn't just luxury. Toilet facilities, as we know them today, were virtually non-existent in many of Europe's grandest homes. The lack of proper sanitation, coupled with the large populations housed in these palaces, made toilet practices an overwhelming problem, one that no amount of wealth could solve. Due to the lack of flushing toilets in most European palaces, including Versailles, royals and their servants relied on chamber pots, which were simple bowls or basins kept in each room. The sheer number of people using these pots in a single building, however, meant that cleanliness was always a concern. Versailles, despite being a symbol of royal grandeur, is perhaps the most notorious example of poor waste management. By the 18th century, the palace housed more than 700 people, but had only 9 bathrooms with flushing toilets. The rest of the court relied on the ever-present chamber pots, which led to the frequent buildup of waste within the palace walls. Servants would rush to empty the pots, but often this was done by simply tossing the contents out of windows onto the grounds below. In some areas, corridors and stairwells became makeshift toilets, especially during crowded events or when the palace was hosting visitors. The stench that resulted was unavoidable. For those living within the palace, the smell was something they became accustomed to, but it often shocked visitors. Several historical accounts describe how visitors were overwhelmed by the odor as soon as they entered the palace grounds. The constant need to mask the smell with heavy perfumes became a necessity, leading to the development of Versailles' infamous sweet but sickly scent. Public defecation wasn't confined to the lower classes. Members of the aristocracy, including women of the royal court, sometimes relieved themselves in public areas. For example, the notorious Princess de Harcourt was known for her shameless behavior at court, where she reportedly relieved herself in the middle of gatherings without care. Her actions were so infamous that other courtiers had to regularly avoid her trails of waste. The system of waste disposal at Versailles was primitive at best. The palace did not have modern plumbing, and its rudimentary system of pipes often became corroded or blocked. In fact, there are documented cases of sewage leaking into important areas of the palace, including Marie Antoinette's private kitchen. Food contamination was an inevitable consequence of these leaks, leading to outbreaks of illness and further compounding the already dire hygienic conditions. Waste management wasn't just a problem for Versailles. Across Europe, other royal palaces faced similar issues. The royal courts in England, particularly during the reign of Henry VIII, also struggled with sanitation. While Henry built luxurious bathrooms for himself, these facilities were few and far between, and many at court were left to use chamber pots, which would be emptied outside the palace. The unsanitary conditions in royal courts had severe health implications. Frequent exposure to human waste, especially when it contaminated food and water supplies, led to widespread diseases such as dysentery. This often resulted in serious illness and even death among both the royal family and their servants. It wasn't until the 19th century, with the advent of modern plumbing, that European palaces began to address these issues with any degree of success. By then, however, the damage had already been done, and the reputation of these palaces for their filth had long been established. But the stench of waste was just the beginning. Next, we delve into a more personal horror that infested their very hair and skin. Number 3. Lice, parasites, and insects. During the medieval and early modern periods, royal women were symbols of wealth, elegance, and power. However, their elaborate clothing and intricate wigs concealed a harsh and itchy reality. In the 16th and 17th centuries, wigs became a fashionable must-have in royal courts across Europe. Particularly in Louis XIV's France, wigs were seen as symbols of sophistication and power, and women's hairstyles grew taller and more elaborate by the year. Royal women such as Marie Antoinette were known for their towering wigs, which were often adorned with ribbons, jewels, and even miniature ships. These wigs, made from human hair, animal hair, or horsehair, presented a major problem as they were rarely, if ever, cleaned. Because these wigs were difficult to maintain and often involved complex hairpieces, they became prime breeding grounds for lice. Wigs were worn for weeks, sometimes even months, without proper washing. The sweat, oils, and perfumes that women applied to their wigs made them even more attractive to pests. The result? Lice would nest in the wigs and spread rapidly, causing intense discomfort. To cope with the itching and irritation, royal women carried silver lice combs or specialized scratching tools that allowed them to discreetly scratch their scalps during social events. This was especially common at Versailles, where social etiquette dictated that any signs of discomfort or poor hygiene be hidden as much as possible. Despite these efforts, it was often difficult to ignore the constant itching caused by the lice living in their wigs. The use of pomades and powders also contributed to the lice problem. Pomades, thick waxy substances used to hold hairstyles in place, were often applied in large quantities to wigs, which trapped dirt and sweat in the hair, making it even more attractive to lice. Powders, commonly made from flour, were also applied to wigs to give them a fashionable white appearance, but these powders did little to deter pests. However, the perception of lice was not limited to uncleanliness. In fact, lice were so common that having them did not carry the stigma we associate with the condition today. Even the highest-ranking women at court accepted that lice were simply a part of life, and regular use of lice combs was a standard part of royal grooming. But the head wasn't the only area where royal women faced hygiene challenges. Intestinal parasites such as tapeworms were another major issue, primarily due to poor food handling and storage practices. Royal women, despite their privileged status, were no more protected from this than the general population. One of the most notorious examples of intestinal parasites in the royal family is Louis XIV of France. Though more commonly associated with male royals, the problem of parasites was widespread, and royal women were equally affected. Louis XIV famously suffered from tapeworms, a type of parasitic worm that lives in the intestines, and reportedly passed a 6-inch-long tapeworm during one of his many bouts of illness. For royal women, who often had to maintain appearances and be present at social functions, the effects of intestinal parasites could be debilitating. These parasites often led to severe abdominal pain, weight loss, and malnutrition. The symptoms were difficult to manage, especially given the limited medical knowledge of the time. Treatments were rudimentary at best, with doctors often prescribing herbal remedies or purgatives, which were intended to cleanse the body of the parasites but frequently did more harm than good. The poor sanitation in royal households was a significant factor in the spread of these parasites. Kitchens were not the clean, sterile environments we think of today. Food was often left exposed to flies and other pests, and the storage methods of the time allowed for contamination. In large palaces like Versailles, where hundreds of people were served daily, the risk of infection was high, and royal women were no more protected than their courtiers. The combination of lice in wigs and intestinal parasites made life at court far less glamorous than it appeared. As medical knowledge began to advance in the 18th and 19th centuries, hygiene practices slowly improved, and wigs fell out of fashion. The introduction of more effective treatments for parasites and the rise of modern medical practices helped alleviate some of the discomforts caused by lice and worms. While lice and parasites plagued their wigs, royal women's fear of bathing only made their hygiene struggles worse. Number 2. Bathing practices. While royal gowns shimmered with luxury, beneath them lay secrets even the royals wouldn't want to reveal. Royal women, despite their elegance and beauty, had an unexpectedly complex relationship with bathing. Hygiene, far from being a mark of civility, was often a practice fraught with fear, superstition, and discomfort in their world. In the Middle Ages and into the 18th century, many royal women rarely took full baths due to widespread beliefs that bathing could cause illness. Water, especially warm water, was seen as dangerous because it was thought to open the pores and allow diseases to enter the body. This belief persisted well into the later centuries, even among the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe, like Queen Marie Antoinette and Catherine the Great. Marie Antoinette, the iconic Queen of France, famously had an elaborate beauty regimen, but it didn't often involve what we would consider a proper bath. In fact, she would rely on sponge baths, using scented waters to freshen herself up without actually submerging in water. The Queen, like many royals of her time, preferred to avoid what she and her court saw as the health risks of water. Instead, perfumes and oils were applied lavishly to cover up any unpleasant body odors. Marie Antoinette's heavy use of perfumes became so notorious that the sweet, heavy scents became a hallmark of Versailles. The same fear gripped other royal courts. Queen Elizabeth I of England, while she was known for her immaculate appearance, reportedly took a full bath only a few times a year. Her hygiene practices, like those of her contemporaries, leaned heavily on perfumes and the regular changing of linens. Elizabeth's linen undergarments were often changed daily to maintain a semblance of cleanliness, but the full-body bathing that we associate with modern hygiene was rare. The Queen's famous white makeup, made of lead, often concealed the grime that accumulated on her skin, which only worsened over time. In earlier centuries, royal bathing practices were even more inconsistent. Medieval queens and noblewomen faced an even greater challenge when it came to hygiene. The medieval period was marked by an extreme scarcity of proper bathing facilities, and even those who had access to baths used them infrequently. King John of England, for example, traveled with his own portable bathtub, but there are few records indicating how often his court actually used it. Henry VIII's reign saw some advances in the availability of baths for royalty, but even then, these baths were considered more of a luxury than a necessity. His personal bathroom at Hampton Court was an opulent space equipped with hot and cold running water, but Henry himself only bathed on rare occasions, typically when advised by doctors. The idea of regular bathing was still seen as dangerous, particularly during outbreaks of diseases like sweating sickness. The scarcity of baths and the reluctance to bathe were not exclusive to England. Across Europe, royalty held similar views on hygiene. Catherine the Great of Russia, for instance, was known for her reluctance to bathe as well. She, like many of her contemporaries, was advised by doctors to avoid regular bathing due to fears of catching illnesses. Instead, Catherine's hygiene routine focused on spot cleaning with alcohol-soaked cloths and the use of oils and perfumes. These practices were not unusual for the time and were considered sufficient to maintain personal cleanliness in royal circles. By the 18th century, however, the tide slowly began to turn, with some royals becoming more comfortable with bathing, although it was still far from being a daily routine. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, was one of the few royals who embraced regular bathing. She used a wooden tub filled with warm water, which was then poured over her body by attendants. However, even Queen Caroline would bathe fully clothed, which highlights the lingering discomfort with exposure to water. After her bath, she would immediately be rushed into bed, wrapped in warm sheets as part of a post-bathing ritual to prevent illness. The decline of public bathhouses also played a significant role in shaping the hygiene practices of royal women. During the medieval period, public bathhouses were common in cities like Paris and London. However, by the late medieval period, these bathhouses began to fall out of favor. They were often associated with immoral activities, including prostitution, which led to their decline across Europe. The fall of public baths reinforced the idea that bathing was not necessary for good health, leaving royal women to rely heavily on perfumes and other methods to maintain cleanliness. The consequences of such limited bathing were obvious. Royal courts, despite their wealth and grandeur, were often rife with lice, skin infections, and other ailments that could have been easily prevented with more regular washing. It wasn't until the 19th century, with the development of modern plumbing, that regular bathing became more common among the European elite. If you thought their reluctance to bathe was shocking, wait until you learn about the grime hidden in their luxurious gowns. Number 1. Clothing. Underneath the elegance of royal gowns, there was a hidden problem, one that no amount of luxury could completely hide. Despite their wealth and prestige, royal women often faced a paradox when it came to maintaining their extravagant clothing. The fabrics they wore, rich silks, velvets, and brocades, were delicate and difficult to clean. Washing these intricate garments would risk damaging their expensive materials, so the solution was to avoid cleaning them entirely. Instead, they relied on frequent changes of undergarments and heavy perfumes to mask the inevitable odors. Marie Antoinette, perhaps the most famous of fashion-forward queens, was known for her lavish wardrobe. She wore gowns adorned with lace, embroidery, and jewels. But these garments were rarely, if ever, cleaned. Weeks and even months of grime accumulated on her dresses. Perfume became her primary defense against the stench, with layers of fragrance applied to both her body and her clothes to create an illusion of cleanliness. However, the sweet smell couldn't hide the reality that her gowns, though exquisite, carried the odor of unwashed fabric and sweat. Similarly, Catherine the Great of Russia, despite being one of the most powerful rulers of her time, dealt with the same issues of hygiene in her clothing. Her court was renowned for its opulence, but like many royal women of her era, she wore her gowns repeatedly without cleaning them. This was not only due to the fragility of the fabrics, but also the sheer number of layers involved in these outfits, which made frequent washing impractical. In Catherine's Russia, winters were long, and the cold made bathing a rare event, further compounding the problem. Madame de Montespan, a famous mistress of Louis XIV, was also known for her grand attire. But like her contemporaries, she wore her dresses repeatedly, and her servants would do their best to scrub away visible stains without truly cleaning the gowns. Over time, the buildup of grime and sweat became a part of the fabric itself. To cope with these hygiene issues, many royal women took to using perfumed headscarves and textile accessories that could be scented to mask their body odor. Additionally, court life was full of crowded gatherings, and the combination of hundreds of individuals in close proximity many of whom hadn't bathed or washed their clothes properly for weeks, created a lingering stench that no amount of perfume could fully hide.